Hi, and welcome back to Math with Sophia, a part of Sola Math. Find more math resources at solamath.com. In this video, we'll be covering how to solve absolute value equations. As a reminder, absolute value is a magnitude like distance. So when we take the absolute value of a quantity, the result will always be positive. For example, the absolute value of 8 is 8. So we can think of it as a distance from 0. The absolute value of negative 8 would also be 8, because negative 8 is still 8 units from 0. And then finally, so we don't get tripped up about this in the future, negative absolute value of 8 is negative 8, because we take the absolute value of 8 and we'll get 8, but there's still this negative out front of it. So that's kind of like negative 1 times the absolute value of 8, which would be negative 1 times 8. So these are good things to remember when we are solving absolute value equations. So let's move on to solving equations. Solving equations where an absolute value is involved is the same as solving linear equations. The only difference is that we're going to have to split the problem up into 2 equations and solve each. So looking at this example right here, the first thing we want to do is look at the absolute value quantity and make sure it is alone on one side of the equation. Once we have checked that, we split the equation up into 2 equations. And that's because 2x can equal 10, that quantity can equal 10, but this quantity can also equal negative 10, because if we take the absolute value of negative 10, it will give us 10. So that's why we split this up into 2 equations. So we'll get 2x equals 10 and 2x equals negative 10. And notice we drop the absolute value bars when we write these equations down here, because we are just saying that this quantity can equal 10, and this quantity inside the bars can equal negative 10. And now we solve each equation. So to get x by itself, we'll divide by 2 on both sides. The 2's cancel out here, and we get x equals 5. Again here, to get x by itself, we divide by 2 on both sides. The 2's cancel out, and we'll get x equals negative 5. So our final answers are x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. All right, so let's move on to another example. And it's important to note that our values aren't always going to be the same with a positive and negative version. We can have completely separate values as our answers. So let's look at another example. So this one is different because we have this absolute value quantity with something else on the same side. So our first step has to be to get this alone. We have to isolate this on one side of the equation before we can make our 2 separate equations. So to do that, we have to get rid of this 5. So we'll add 5 to both sides. The 5's cancel out, and we'll have the absolute value of x plus 7 equals 14 plus 5 is 19. So now that we have the absolute value alone on one side, we can split our equation up into our 2 separate equations. So we drop the absolute value bars and we get x plus 7 equals positive 19 and x plus 7 equals negative 19. And then we solve each equation. So we need to get rid of 7 to get the x by itself. So we subtract 7 on both sides. These cancel out and we'll get x equals 19 minus 7 is 12. And then again on this equation, we subtract 7 from both sides. The 7's cancel out and we get x equals negative 19 minus 7 will give us negative 26. So our final answers are x equals 12 and x equals negative 26. So as you can see, our answers can be very different, not always the same value. Let's look at another example. Remember, our first step is to isolate the absolute value. So we need to first get rid of this negative 2. So we're going to add 2 to both sides. Our 2's cancel out. Bring down our negative 5x in the absolute value bars equals 8 plus 2 gives us 10. So now we can split our equation up into our 2 separate ones, and we'll get negative 5x equals positive 10, and negative 5x equals negative 10. So we solve each equation, divide by negative 5 to get x by itself. Negative 5 cancels out, and we get x equals negative 2. Again, divide by negative 5 on both sides. Negative 5 cancels out, and we get x equals positive 2. So our final answers are x equals negative 2 and x equals positive 2. Let's look at another example. Okay, so we want to make sure the absolute value quantity is isolated, and it is. So our first step in this one is to break our equation up into 2 separate ones. Dropping the absolute value bars, we'll get 2x plus 3 equals positive 5, and 2x plus 3 equals negative 5. So we're going to get x by itself. So we subtract 3 on both sides. These cancel out and we'll get 2x equals 2. Divide by 2 on both sides, and we get x equals 1. And then the same process over here, subtract 3 on both sides. 3's cancel out, bring down our 2x equals negative 5 minus 3 is negative 8. Divide by 2 on both sides, and we'll get x equals negative 4. So our final answers are x equals 1 and x equals negative 4. Let's try another example that's a little different. All right, so this example is to show you that not all absolute value problems will have solutions. So the first thing we want to do is get the absolute value isolated. That means we have to add 3 on both sides. Our 3's cancel out here. We'll bring down our negative 2 times the absolute value of x plus 4 equals 9 plus 3 is 12. Now we have to divide by negative 2 on both sides. These cancel out. We'll bring down our absolute value of x plus 4 equals 12 divided by negative 2 is negative 6. So this equation has no solution because the absolute value, this quantity, once we take the absolute value of it, it's going to have to be positive. anything we put in here, if I put a -6 in here with the absolute value bars around it, that would equal +6. So this is not possible. So there are no solutions to this problem. Let's look at another example. So this is an interesting problem because with absolute value equations, sometimes there are two solutions, sometimes there are no solutions, and sometimes there is one solution. And this is an example of an absolute value equation that only has one solution. So let's get started with solving this. Our absolute value is not isolated, so we have to get that by itself, which means get rid of this 1. Subtract 1 from both sides. The 1's cancel out. We'll bring down our absolute value of 7x minus 5 equals 1 minus 1 is 0. Now that our absolute value is isolated, we can break it up into our two equations, and we'll get 7x minus 5 equals 0. And look at this, 7x minus 5, there's no -0. So both of our equations are exactly the same, which means we only have one equation to solve. These two equations are the same. So we add 5 to both sides. 7x equals 5. Divide by 7 on both sides. And 7's cancel out, and we'll get x equals 5/7. So that is our single answer for this. There is only one solution here. And we'll do one final example. So the first thing we need to do is isolate our absolute value quantity on one side of the equation. So we're going to get rid of this 6, subtract 6 from both sides. Our 6's cancel out, and we're left with 3 times the absolute value of -8x plus 2 on one side and 54 on the other. Now we'll divide by 3 on both sides. So our 3's cancel out. We're left with the absolute value of -8x plus 2 on one side, and 54 divided by 3 gives us 18. So now we have our absolute value all alone on one side, so we can split our equation up into our two separate ones. So we'll drop the absolute value bars, and we get -8x plus 2 equals +18, and -8x plus 2 equals -18. So we'll subtract 2 from both sides. 2's cancel out. We have -8x equals 16. Divide by -8 on both sides. -8 cancels out. We get x equals -2 for one of our solutions. And now let's look at our other problem. Subtract 2 on both sides. Our 2's cancel out. Bring down our -8x on the left. And -18 minus 2 is -20. Divide by -8 on both sides. Our -8's cancel out. We're left with x on the left. And -20 over -8 simplifies. Negative divided by negative is a positive, so those are going to cancel out. And then we can divide both of these numbers, they're both divisible by 4. Divided by 4 on the top and the bottom. So we're going to be left with 5. 20 divided by 4 is 5, and 8 divided by 4 is 2. So x equals 5 over 2. And these are our two final answers. X equals -2 and x equals 5 over 2. And that is how you solve absolute value equations. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button and subscribe for more.